All right. We are back with the 104th episode of the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. I cannot tell you how excited I am for this podcast episode for a variety of reasons. One of them being that we got a very special guest. This is the first time ever I have done a live podcast. So it could go completely awry, and it is what it is, but we're going to make it work nonetheless. So just a quick few announcements. It's been months and months and months since I have recorded, and for a variety of reasons. One, most of you are already aware that I am a principal again, and here we are. We're actually in my school because I didn't have enough room in my normal podcasting place. So we're recording here at my school. But besides the new role of a principal, let me tell you, for the educators out there, IFers 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 out. It's because of you all that this has happened. So if you were on the podcast and the audio went out, sorry about that. It's back. I'll edit that out of the podcast. But anyway, welcome to the podcast as always. And I want to introduce my guest that I have here with me live. We are in Nashville, Tennessee, but that is not where she is from. So I have Shannon Harvey here with me. Shannon, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Normally I give a bio, but I just want you to introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Shannon Harvey. I'm a journalist, author, and filmmaker, and I come from Sydney, Australia.
I mean, just around the corner, right?
That's right.
Just around the corner. So let's tell us a little bit about your filmmaking, because it's not just normal filmmaking, right? I think what you said is filmmaking with a purpose, right? So tell us a little bit about the films that you make, why you make them, and what you're focusing on.
So just by way of background, I started out my career in conventional journalism. I was a news and current affairs journalist working for the national broadcaster in Australia, and then later one of the major online and print organisations. And all those years ago, that was a time when my industry was in a big transition. The big digital disruption was just happening right when I was really kicking off my career about 20 years ago. And now looking back on it, I've come to understand that kind of journalism that I did is something called problems journalism, where my job was to tell the world what was wrong with the world. And now I take all of my stylistic reporting from a new school of journalism and also a new school of documentary filmmaking. In journalism, it's called solutions journalism. In filmmaking, it's called impact documentary storytelling. And essentially what I do now is I embed the solutions to the problems that I'm reporting on within the stories that I tell.
I can't imagine what that does for yourself, right? Not just identifying problems, but also looking at solutions. And I think that I relate to that a lot in education, where we do a lot of problem identification, but then it's what the response. And unfortunately in education, what I think we normally do is we do what we've always done and hope for different results. And I hear you saying, hey, we've identified problems in my previous filmmaking, and now it's not just a problem, but solutions. So tell a little bit how you ended up here in Nashville, having this first live podcast I've ever done, and just the time that we've gotten together. I say we because we have a man behind the camera over here, and we'll show you that in a bit. But tell us a little bit about how you got here and what project you're working on.
Well, this podcast has a little bit to do with it, as you know. So I'm currently in the midst of producing my third feature film. My first film was called The Connection. My second film was called My Year of Living Mindfully. And now I am turning my mind to raising my children. And the film I'm making is called Raising Superheroes. And the problem that the film identifies is the fact that children all around the world are suffering very deeply with their mental health. And we now know that if you develop a mental illness while you're a child, there's a very high likelihood that you will suffer for the rest of your life. We now know that, in fact, 75% of all mental illness begins when we're young. And so if you think about mental illness as a recurring problem, it makes sense to me that we should really start in childhood if we want to take on the global mental health crisis that we're facing. And as part of my mission to find solutions to this problem, I was looking for somebody who is disrupting the education space. And I can't think of anybody, that your listeners
I don't know.
may be able to identify. I'm not sure, but obviously I'm talking about you. And so I've flown all the way from Sydney, Australia to meet you and to document the trauma-informed school that you are currently running. And we've been filming here now with you for a few days, and I just, my mind is completely blown. I knew that when I was coming here, I was going to be meeting a special person and seeing a special school, but I didn't know the extent to which I would walk away and feel very inspired.
For educators, I think hearing that, it feels awkward. Hearing that you discovered this school myself. I'll be honest, when you first emailed me, I didn't really think it had anything to do with me. I thought it had to do with the school and what we were trying to do. And now I realize the impact somebody can have. And I think for educators out there who listen to this podcast or doing this work, realize what you're doing has an impact. And whether it's the student that's in your classroom or in your school, or it's a teacher that you work with, or it's a filmmaker that you're working with, impact is impact. And I think owning that impact is really important. It's hard for educators. I think a lot of times we get into this for impact, but then when it comes down to somebody identifying that impact, it feels weird, right? It feels weird to go, well, thank you. But it's what we do. But you're right. It's been a great week that we've been here. And for those of you who don't know, this is my third month here at Goodlettsville Elementary School, and it is a fantastic place. And we're growing daily. I'm growing daily. I know that coming back post-pandemic, although I was a principal post-pandemic, now a couple years out, educational climate has significantly changed. And I wasn't quite as prepared as I thought I was, right? Because the climate has changed. And I'm here in Tennessee, so there's a lot of layers to that. But so let's talk about some of the stuff that you've seen since you've been here. And really, I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about the school, the kids, the adults, because I agree. This is a pretty remarkable place. And it's not just the building that we're in, because the building is pretty spectacular. I mean, we have a 2-story slide. I mean, that's cool itself. But let's talk through some of the things that you've seen that you didn't anticipate, or that maybe you were excited to see.
I think one thing that is very visual about the school is how beautifully designed it is. And as you say, the giant slide at the entrance when you walk in is pretty cool. And it's been really well designed from the perspective that there's lots of spaces. It's very intentional. But I think the big surprising thing for me has been seeing the trauma-informed practices in operation within the school. And we've still got a few more days that we're filming with you. And I anticipate that I'll be seeing more. But some of the things that have really stood out to me, we popped our head into the first classroom, and I immediately saw the Peace Corner in action. There was a young boy who had set his timer. He was off in the corner. He was throwing a small squishy ball just to calm himself down, or what you would call get regulated. And then he wasn't quite done. So he just reset the timer and he just kept going. And then eventually I saw him get up and sit back and continue on with the class without any disruption whatsoever. And it wasn't just that, though. That classroom, I could tell that the teacher had really bonded with the students. There were lovely messages pinned up on her wall from the kids, gratitude, genuine gratitude messages for the teacher. And all of this is to say that you can have, this is my big takeaway, is that you can have a building that is optimally designed to be a trauma-informed school, but the practices and the relationships are actually what's going to make a difference. Yeah.
I mean, if I could sum something up, that is it. I always say that's why trauma-informed isn't a program, right? Because a program is something people have to implement. The people are what makes trauma-informed. The relationships that you see. And you're right. When we went into that room, they didn't know we were even coming in. And we popped in and there was a student using the Peace Corner. And I think for educators, we're constantly hearing, well, they're going to take advantage of it, or, how much they spend too much time there. But as we watched that unfold, I noticed that not one kid was distracted by that student. And he did exactly what the expectation was. He used the space. He was throwing a koosh ball. He set the timer and then a little bit more time and he transitioned right back. Nobody even paid any attention. It wasn't as if anything was out of the normal. And that shows the power of practice and how students will adjust when we teach them explicitly what to do when somebody is using the Peace Corner, all of those expectations. It's very clear. And you are right. It's about the relationship. And a matter of fact, I spoke to that teacher today and she said, I saw they were behind my desk and I wonder if they saw the note from one of my students apologizing to me because they didn't do what the expectation was. And I said, I don't know, but if they did, that's pretty awesome. Right. And I think what you would also see is adults apologizing to kids when they mess up. And I think that's awesome. So, you haven't seen it all, and we're still working through that. So, what are you anticipating for this film, Raising Superheroes? What is the big picture? What is the overall theme? And obviously, it's about you said you focus on raising your children, but what is it going to consist of?
Well, as you now know, I'm a solutions journalist. So, what you'll see in the film is not the retelling of children with mental health problems.
Yes.
So I think that we in the media and those in advocacy have done a really excellent job raising awareness about the need to talk about mental health. I think that piece has been pretty well done. We have lots of mental health awareness days, lots of initiatives. We're also at a time when we have never had more knowledge about what causes mental illness and trauma and suffering and what effects it can have on our mind, body, and our whole lives. So it's an interesting problem, isn't it? Because we now know more, we now have more, and yet all of the data shows us that it's getting worse. So what are we doing wrong? And that's what the film is exploring. And what's the how of solving this problem once and for all? And I can tell you that on my journey, there has been a lot of eye-opening surprises. Yeah.
Oh, I can't wait to see what those are, right? And I'm glad we might be one of those. But I think you're right. And I think I have this conversation with educators all the time, right? We can't navigate the world now from our perspective within our children's lived experience. We're not in the same space. We're not in the same time. I told somebody the other day, I never in my educational career did an active shooter drill, right? That didn't exist to me. And for those of you who might be listening from across the globe, and I know this is a global podcast, just the idea of children doing an active shooter drill, I know drops jaws around this world. Because when I did travel to Australia a couple of years ago in New Zealand, the deep conversations that I had with people about that one topic was mind-blowing to them, right? I even say that in schools now, there is a film on most windows that are shatter and bullet resistant. Those didn't exist when I was in school. We didn't live through a pandemic, right? We didn't have social media. So to answer those questions of why is it getting worse, I think because students have access and experiences that we didn't. And I think we have to step back, because I know here, especially in the US, there's this whole push to do more of what we've always done. And to me, that is the definition of insanity, doing what we've always done and hoping we get a different result when what we did before wasn't effective in the first place. And so when you came here and we had these discussions that I just had, what was your thought at the beginning when I said, we do have film, we do have drills, we do have all of these things? What was your initial thought in that space?
It's one thing to talk about it like you and I are now, but it's a completely different thing to see it.
Yeah.
And it's not just the bulletproof glass windows that strikes me. It's the fact that whilst we were filming, there was a constant police presence out front of the school. One thing that after our first full day of filming with you, one thing that was in my mind as I was drifting off to sleep was a quick off-the-cuff interview that I had done with you. You'd just wrapped up for the school day. You'd waved all those kids goodbye. They were getting on the school bus. End of a long day for you. And then you shared with me that just down the road from here, there was actually a shooting, and that the person who shares your position at that school was killed. And that really hit me like a ton of bricks. Like I understand that the children are dealing with that. But you, as the leader of this school, are carrying that burden as well. And that you've, above the entrance doors to the school, you've got the words "you are safe" for the kids to read the second that they come through the doors. And I actually believe you. They are safe with you as their carer. So I think that it's very striking. It's very striking to understand the level of trauma, or the level of threat, I should say, that is felt here, in Nashville on a daily basis. Yeah.
And I think that's so important to remember. And if you've listened to the podcast, you all know that that was just a couple years ago, and it was the Covenant shooting where there were 6 people, 3 adults and 3 children that lost their lives to gun violence. And, it's interesting because that's become a normal part of our existence. And that, to me, speaks to the incomprehensibleness that we live through. And I think it's really important to know that educators bear that weight now, right? That post-Columbine and post-Sandy Hook, really Sandy Hook was the big elementary school tragedy. Educators became frontline workers. For the first time ever in our careers, we were seen as frontline workers, where literally our lives could potentially be on the line. And I think that in itself has caused a ton of pressure, a ton of stress, even potentially some trauma within educators, because we know that educators are leaving the field within the first 3 years. And we're having a hard time replenishing those that are leaving. So, I think when we talk about trauma-informed education, it isn't just what are we doing for the students, right? It's what we're also doing for the adults. And so as you've kind of learned more and you've been traveling, what is that idea of the adult as well needing to have some care? How has that played a role in what you've learned and what you've been documenting?
I've actually, one of the interesting parts of the film that I wasn't expecting to be covering is that this is just as much about raising superheroes, being our children, as it is about raising parents and raising teachers and raising people in high-powered positions who are making really important decisions on a daily basis. So one of the many big takeaways for me is this idea that it's going to take a village in order to solve this problem, and that we all have a part to play, and that a big part of it is supporting the parents and supporting the teachers and to putting the systems in place that are needed to do that. I'll just add one thing, is that we constantly believe that the causes of mental illness are about an individual problem.
I agree.
And, you know, if you develop depression or anxiety or any of those big ones, you know, when I say big, I mean common, we think that we've got to fix it ourselves, that there's something innate within us. But one of the really big takeaways for me is that we need to fix the environment that is causing these conditions. That a child who might be experiencing anxiety within the walls of this school because they are living with the threat of gun violence is a perfectly reasonable, anxious response to a genuine threat. There is nothing wrong with that child.
You know, and it's interesting because most of you probably are aware that I've co-authored a book that will be coming out in February called Reducing Stress in Schools. And one of the things that we discuss in that book is the idea of a socio-ecological model, which means we look at a wider view and then we narrow it down. We start with the historical and structural context. We cannot leave out the idea of what has happened in the past as a stressor, as a contributor to mental health. We know that there is an intergenerational transmission of trauma due to historical context, whether that be slavery in our country, whether that be oppression, whatever it is, can play a role. And we know that through the epigenetic study, right? So we know about the genomes and the impacts of the environment and toxic and stress and trauma. But then we also have to look at the systems in which we operate. And I think what I get frustrated, especially being in the state that I'm in, where there are virtually no protection of gun laws, that creates and contributes to what you're saying, is this stress and anxiety and all of that to people. Right. And then we go down even narrower and we began to look at communities within these systems, and then even narrower to the individual and interpersonal experiences. But you're right. Without backing up and looking at those rings, we can't blame, point, or expect the individual to fix themselves. And as I've said 1,000 times, we're not fixing kids with trauma-informed work. We are fixing broken systems that have contributed to students with mental health issues. I'm so glad that that came out because it's true. And it comes with our educators too, right? That the amount of stress and what we ask them to do on a daily basis has changed over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The days of just coming and teaching, planning teaching, they're no longer here, right? We're managing a lot of social stressors in the day-to-day of our students. And there is an expectation in a lot of places that kids just come, sit, and listen. I'd say you can have that expectation. The only person that's going to be let down is you, because kids are doing the best they can as well. So what do you see next steps in this realm of raising superheroes? And what are some things that you're like, wow, if we could get these shifts, I think they would play a really big impact?
So I'm only as good as the next person I'm about to interview. I always get really excited just before I interview the next person because I'm so deep in their research. And I know for you, this is going to be information that you're well and truly across. But one of the people I'm about to fly to Minnesota to interview is a really amazing woman named Ann Maston, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota. And she is what I consider, I hope she doesn't mind me calling her this, but she's like the mother of resilience research. And she was the custodian of some seriously influential longitudinal studies on what makes children thrive despite their adversity. And she has since trawled through all of the literature. We've now got 20 years of really solid, high quality evidence looking at why do some kids, you know, face what they've experienced and they come out reasonably well, or some of them even, you know, rise to the top.
Absolutely.
Whereas other kids just suffer so deeply for the rest of their lives. And although I think you and I grew up in a generation where we were told that there was something innately special about those people, right? Like our superheroes, they've got some kind of superpower. The really amazing insight from Anne's research and the whole body of resilience research is that it's about something that Anne calls ordinary magic.
I love that.
Okay. And so let's say that the children here at this school are experiencing what resilience researchers would call risk factors. Is this something your audience will be familiar with, risk factors?
I am.
Okay. So the risk factors are things like adverse childhood events might be happening in their lives. There may be any number of big risk factors that they've got, even malnutrition.
Food scarcity, poverty, racism, all of those things. Yes.
Right. So we are in an age of the rise of the risk factors. But what the resilience research shows us is that you can counterbalance that with protective factors. And so here I am in this amazing school, and I am seeing a whole lot of counterbalancing. I'm seeing high fives in the hallway. I'm seeing children who have deep bonds with their teachers. And we know from the research that just having a solid relationship with one adult, doesn't even necessarily have to be a parent, can be a major protective factor. So you asked me what's next and what's the message. What I would love to see is the rise of the protective factors. If we all started thinking of ourselves as Cinderella's fairy godmother, giving her the beautiful clothes that sent her to the ball that changed her life. If we all start thinking of ourselves as being the Alfred to Batman.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Alfred just gave Batman a whole lot of fancy tools, and then away Batman went and saved Gotham City. So if we start seeing ourselves as that, then I think that we actually might start making a real difference. And I mean top down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because I always say, I grew up in a very conservative evangelical home, and it's a lot of those teachings have obviously made me who I am. But I always say it's interesting. I always find that people are waiting for an angel to appear when every day, every single one of us have an opportunity to be an angel for somebody. They don't have to know us. They don't have to interact with us again. And yet at some point, we could be that buffer for someone and never, ever interact again. But it could be the one piece that makes the world of difference. And I know in our conversations, we've talked about Dr. Karen Treisman out of the UK and her work, and her one quote that just always resonated with me is, every interaction could be an intervention. So knowing that every high five in a school, every knuckle bump, every I'm glad you're here, every hug that we give, every affirmation that we do, or every boundary that we hold could be the one point in a child's life that sets them up to be a superhero, right? And I say that I would say that all that my focus is ever is just to have kids identify their own genius, that I don't want them to do things for me or because of me. I want them to do them for themselves and because of themselves. And if I could be that push that gets kids to see themselves in ways that I believe they are, and even surpass that, is exactly what we should be doing. And yet in education, it gets muddled sometimes, right? I think we talked before about how easy it feels like it should be, yet how complicated it is, right? And let's talk about some of the complicatedness that you have seen in your travels and in the research around what makes this work so complicated. What if you've taken away of like, okay, it seems so simple. Relationships matter. Connection matters. Building kids and decreasing those protective or increasing the protective factors. What makes it so complicated?
I almost gave up on this film, I have to tell you, because some time ago I had done all the research of what was causing the rise of mental illness in young people. And it was all of these things that were completely and utterly out of my control as a parent, as a journalist. And I almost gave up. But I'm traveling around the world at the moment, and I'm looking at the bright spots, and I no longer see it as complicated. I've got to be honest with you.
Yeah, I know.
You know, like it actually is really quite straightforward. Like if we can just counterbalance those risk factors with protective factors, And I'm seeing it in operation in a school environment right now with you. It is entirely doable. You are modeling that this is doable. And so I don't think once the world sees the story that I'm putting together about you as part of this overall documentary, I don't think that there will be an excuse anymore.
I mean, wow. Yes. And it's interesting because there are times I'm like, I'll be honest, I get frustrated in that I don't understand why people don't get it. Right. And that is a challenging thing. And I'll tell you, I hit burnout because of that. Right. That here's the science. It's very clear. It outlines exactly what we need to do with protective factors, right? Whether that's food, clothing, education, relationships, all of that, belonging. And yet people still have a hard time grasping that I have to do it differently. And then I have to step back. And I've done this many times in my career and say, but that adult right now is also doing the best they can. So how do I build them, meet their need to be able to not be at capacity so they can de-escalate themselves in their system, to see this so they know the next step. And my focus has always been model, model, model. If I'm asking adults to do something with kids, I must be willing to do that with adults as well. And I think that is so important. And I'll be honest, it's hard. It's hard from an administrator, from an adult, because you forget students and children with trauma and stress and mental health grow up with adults with stress, trauma, and potentially mental health. It doesn't just go away. There are protective factors that we can put in place, and there's a lot of support, but it is challenging. It is challenging to navigate that.
And I just want to add as well that I think that whilst the work here within the walls of this school is absolutely extraordinary, your students are still going home.
Fact.
You know, and so this work is not just about schools. It should not be on schools. It should not just be on teachers. And at one point in the film, before I discovered you and your work, at one point in the film storyline, I was actually going to conclude that we cannot put this on teachers.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I think we also need to be realistic about what can be achieved by just one environment.
That's right.
And that's why, as you've been talking about, and I'm sure is in your book as well, is it's about the whole ecosystem.
And you're exactly right. And I think I was actually looking at my phone. I wasn't checking my phone. I was actually looking at a post that I made from the Trauma Informed Educators Network just this week. And it was, let me get there just a second because it's so valid. Wrong one. I have way too many accounts, but here we go. The quote was, everything in society we don't address lands in a teacher's lap.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where the exhaustion comes in, where for those of you who know me and follow me, I'm very politically active. Before I came back to be a principal, I was not afraid to go to what we refer to as the Hill here, the Capitol in Tennessee, and voice my opinion and get behind those opinions that are important. Because I also know, as one entity of education, we can't do it alone. We can absolutely have a major impact. But if our kids are coming hungry, right? If our kids don't have access to healthcare, if our kids don't have access to housing, if our kids don't have access to transportation, those layers are really deep. And it goes to what I was talking about in our book. Those layers of systems and structures and historical context all play a role in an individual's lived experience. We can't just put it on an individual to say, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I don't know what the problem is. While my son is going home and being fed every night and is experiencing organized sports and all of these things, that is privilege. That is by definition exactly what it is. And everybody isn't starting from the same starting line. But for some reason, especially in some realms, we all expect everybody to get to the same finish line.
Can I just add one thing there
please.
as well? One of the really interesting things that I've come across in the literature is that a risk factor to a child can also be in a high performance education setting.
100%.
You know, and so you might have that child in a quote unquote privileged, you know, home environment, but they're being pushed every single day at elite sport or elite academia. And one of the reasons why I began making this film is that the area that my kids are growing up in on the northern beaches of Sydney had just had a suicide epidemic amongst young people. You know, and so what is it about this area where you know, it's a very multicultural area, but it's by definition relatively wealthy, and those kids are all being given quote unquote excellent educations. But there were children who had come to the conclusion that their lives weren't living.
Wow. You know, I think that comes to the relational trauma too, and how we're connecting with our kids. When you have, my wife works full time, I work full time. I spent the last 2 years working from home. That means I got to go to all the school things, take them to school every day. And I see a difference, right? And I see a different role. So I think bringing that up is really important, because I think in this work, it's a lot easier. And I think I've told you my story that when I started learning about trauma, it was about everybody else, right? And then I had to realize, whoa, hold on a minute. This actually has something to do with me too. It's a lot easier to think about this as, well, that's for those kids, right? But in our communities, in my community, in my son's school, suicide and suicide ideation is at a high rate right now, probably more than it's ever been. And I think bringing that up is really important, because I think it's always good for us to check in with ourselves and go, but how's our own? How is our own? Because those conversations are key.
And I'll just give you a little anecdote. As I travel around interviewing a lot of world-leading experts on the subject, almost every single one of them has taken me aside at the end of the interview and said, you know, Shannon, I just want you to know I've had my own trauma. You know, and the stories of these people who are changing the world are all motivated by something that happened to them in childhood.
I wish I could say I was surprised, but I'm not. And the reason I'm not is because my network of people that I'm connected to, we all share these stories, right? And I think empathy plays a major role. I give the example of I had to apologize to a staff member at my previous school because she had lost her parent. And I was empathetic, I thought, until I lost my own parent. And then I realized, wow, like, I don't think I had made that connection close enough, because I didn't know the depth of grief that brought. And I went back and I said, I'm sorry that I didn't show up better. And I think that comes to this work, why we're showing up to try to change this paradigm is because we want to see better for kids, our own children, of course, but generations after, right? People always ask, why did you go back to be a principal? Or why do you stay in the state of Tennessee when you deal with all the political stuff that you do? Because I believe and I hope that it's going to be better. And I operate daily that it's going to be better. And I think that those of us in this work, we all believe it's going to be better. We may not see the fruits of the labor. And I will tell people, I've already seen fruits of the labor, like whether it's a student or whether it's a system shift. But there's a lot of people that might not, but yet this work keeps moving on. And I think to you, how does that resonate with you and the work you do? Because you're making a film, right? You've made multiple films, and then you put it in the world, and then what? So
that's the beauty of impact filmmaking, is that making the movie is actually only the halfway point. And so we will be releasing this film through a global impact campaign. And I'm happy to tell your listeners that they will be able to host screenings in their own community won't cost them anything to be able to license the film to screen it in their community. They can use it in whichever way it serves, whether it be in an educational setting, whether it be to gather a whole bunch of important people to host a Q&A. There's many different ways. We'll also be releasing it online for a period of time for free, depending on our philanthropic support, maybe even permanently, but we'll see on that.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the great thing about impact filmmaking, is that we can do a lot in terms of reaching a lot of people. And then hopefully it reaches the right people so that the things that need to change actually get changed. And the people who need to be inspired will be inspired. And so, I've got school-age children, and it's my hope that principals around the world are going to see how it is done through your modelling, and that we will turbocharge this trauma-informed schools movement. Yeah.
Well, no pressure. No pressure. But and
the great thing is on that, you don't have to do anything differently. You just keep doing you.
Thank goodness. And I want to say too, we haven't got it all figured out. And I think that's the power. And, when we talked earlier, I know I told you, I can't wait to look back in 5 years, which I intend to be at this school, and say that's where we were, but look where we are now, because there is no end point to this work. I always say, if you're looking to be the most trauma-informed educator or school, it doesn't exist. That the science is still progressing quickly. The more we're learning, the more we're going to adjust. This is a journey. It is not a destination. And to think that this film is going to have a major impact, but just know it's one point in this journey of transformation and trauma-informed education. And to hear what you just said, that people are going to have access to do their own screenings of this. If you haven't learned, this isn't a money-making adventure, no. Right? You're not Definitely getting rich off of this. I know I'm not.
Yeah.
So I think that's the part of what I love, that this idea of impact films is that this is really to put into the world, to make a difference, to show people this is what we know, this is what we're doing. And there's a documentary, I don't know if you've ever seen it, I think it came out in 2016 called Resilience. And there's a line in that movie that says, if you get the science to the hand of the general population, they will invent wisely. And I feel like that's exactly what this is. You're just putting the science in some practice. You're putting it out there, and then let's see it grow.
Yeah, but just to add one element to that is that one of the questions I've been asking the scientists who I'm interviewing is, give me some examples of how this science is being used in the real world. And more often than not, they say, I don't know. Right? And so none of them could point me towards this whole network that you've established here. None of them even knew that this movement was happening. And in fact, some of them, would point me to things that were happening and then tell me why they were wrong.
Wow.
So I think what hasn't yet happened is this cross-pollination where the scientists realize that it's actually being implemented, and then the implementation is then studied. And that would be really cool as well, to see kind of the next generation, or what some people would call maybe the in the resilience research, I think we'd be up to the 5th wave, where the first wave was just trying to discover what makes people resilient. And then there's been subsequent waves, and I think we're sort of merging now into this next iteration. Yeah.
I want you all to hear what was just said, that the researchers and the research that many of us have taken and ran with it aren't aware that people are taking it and running with it, and then referring to this is science into practice. That blows. When you told me that before, it blew my mind. And I'm not going to lie, I think I've mentioned that to 3 people, going, you guys won't believe this, because without their research, right, we wouldn't be doing what we do. But I think without the practicality of what we do, the research are just identifying a potential problem, right? So I think that these combinations of things are key. And I hope one day I can thank them and then say, and this is happening all over the world, that people are using what you're doing to change what they do. And I think, isn't that the whole point of research and getting information to people? But you all, that is a fast episode of 45 minutes. So I always ask this question to all of my guests, and I'm going to ask it to you as well. If you could tell educators something right now, what would it be?
Thank you.
That is the shortest answer ever, and I think it's spot on. I mean, I get it. That's exactly right. And I think, to be quite honest, those two words aren't uttered enough for educators. They don't hear it enough. Depending on where you are, a lot of times we are political pawns in between multiple agendas. And I think those words, so if you're a parent, if you are a community member, if you are a researcher, whomever you are, I challenge you to use those two words with an educator in your life. And I will tell you, educators just aren't people who support our kids. There are spouses, there are brothers, our sisters, our uncles, our aunts, our moms, our dads. We are everywhere. And I think those two words could be uttered so well. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for coming all the way across the world to meet us. I cannot believe that I get to be a part of something so remarkable. I pinch myself often. And for those of you who are in the other part of the world, in Australia and New Zealand, just FYI, I'm coming to you here in, I think it's like 12, 14 days. On the 28th of October, I'll be flying out of here and heading to Brisbane for the Trauma Aware Conference in Brisbane. So I just saw a post and I shared it with you, 850 people are registered and there's not many spots left. So if you have not registered, please do that and come and say hi to me. I may even try to pack this little machine here and do a podcast while I'm there. Who knows? This was my first live one, so now I'm a veteran. But you might even be able to meet Shannon. She might even be at the conference as well. So I hope to see you all there. And as always, please, please. All right. Thank you all who were here on live. I know I don't see all of you. I appreciate you being here. Thank you, Kelly, for being on here. It's so good to see you. I hope your work in North Carolina is going well. So we will see you soon. All right. Have a good night.